Us.
You.
And me. We listen to you.
Our city.
Wake up, citizen. We are a part of the whole thing.
Evolving.
Evolve.
Our roots and visions build our tomorrow. We walk
Together our common path.
I move with you.
We grow up and learn.
ahead.
It's possible.
It is. It will.
We love.
We care.
Improving day by day.
What can we do for you?
Why do you like me?
Why do we like you?
Breathing the same air.
We share and experiment. We move and change.
We can do so many things.
Let's talk.
Let's create.
Let's innovate. We can do it together.
You made me feel alive.
We want to make our dreams come true.
Have a co-creative day.
It's a brand
It's a
new
brand
day.
new day. New day.
Good evening, welcome. We are approaching the end of this new edition of the Smart City Expo World Congress, and we have the opportunity to do that with David Bollier. David Bollier is an American activist and a scholar, an independent scholar, who is one of the most known and influential exponents of a global movement that has been growing in the last 2 decades around the practice and the idea of the commons. The commons are, at the same time, one of the oldest way that community used to manage shared resources like natural resources that existed across centuries and across societies all over the world, and they have been rediscovered as a way of doing, a new way of doing, on the frontier of the technological revolution, which, with the experiences like Wikipedia, of the huge success of the free and open source software movement as exemplification of this new way of doing things, inspired by the idea of the commons. And across and between these two extremes, if you like, there is a huge field of innovation, of new way of doing things, new way of thinking that emerged, inspired by the idea of the commons. In some way, most of all, this new paradigm, as David likes to define the idea of the commons, is most of all, as I was saying, a new way of doing, of thinking. As a book of David itself expresses very well in its title, that is, Think Like a Commoner. Today, David is going to propose us how the idea of the commons can inspire a new way of looking at the cities. Ladies and gentlemen, David Bollier, The Cities as a Commons.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a real honor to be in Barcelona, which is a leader of so much efforts at developing the city as the commons. I want to talk a little bit today about, we'll start with the simple question of what is the commons? Because many people, there's a lot of different ideas about it, but I think one way we can start to understand it is by, first of all, its non-existence in many people's minds. Many people think that the state and the market are the only meaningful areas of activity, or power, or governance, and the commons just is kind of this vague cloud underneath. But I hope to show in my talk that the commons is really quite robust and has its own definition and is a category unto itself that works sometimes together and sometimes not so closely with the market and the state. It has its own sovereignty. But one reason it's often misunderstood is because of this whole idea of the tragedy of the commons, which most people have heard of. And this was started because of a 1968 article by Garrett Hardin, who was a biologist, who wrote an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. And he said, imagine you have a pasture in which anybody can graze as many cattle as they want. It'll be overexploited and ruined and create what he called the tragedy. In fact, his whole analysis was more of a lazy smear or a fable because it had lots of hidden assumptions in it, such as the tragedy of the unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. There's a lot of assumptions embedded in the whole tragedy mythology. And part of it is he was focusing on the resources alone and not on the commons as a social system, because the commons is chiefly a system by which we cooperate together to manage shared wealth in sustainable ways. And there are countless examples of these around the world, especially in natural resource areas. It's arguably the oldest system in human history for managing shared wealth. And it took this person, Indiana University professor Eleanor Ostrom, to help debunk the tragedy of the commons theory through her empirical fieldwork and creative theorizing around the world, mostly in natural resource commons, farmlands, fisheries, irrigation water, and so forth, to show that it's an entirely sustainable model of managing shared wealth. She won the Nobel Prize for this in 2009, the first woman to win, and not so, in some ways not so surprising, in 2009, right after the 2008 crisis, when they wanted to highlight some different ways of looking at economics. And I think as a woman, she was more attuned to relationships being influential in economic activity, cooperation. And that's what built her career, and she spawned an entire international network of scholars who study the commons. One aspect of talking about the commons is the idea of enclosures. Now, when we talk about enclosures of the city, first of all, we want a commons that's open, sociable, and participatory, but in the city, a enclosure will consist of being overbuilt, overmarketized, unequal, and unfair. Now that states the difference rather starkly, but it gives you an idea of what enclosure is all about. Enclosure is about the privatization of shared wealth. It's about turning wealth into commodities, what was formerly shared and non-monetized, non-market sharing, sociality, and so forth. And in the process of enclosing a resource, it dispossesses people who had depended upon it for either their survival or their basic needs. So this is an important concept when talking about the commons, the idea of enclosure. And market enclosures are ubiquitous around the world. It's one of the great problems of our time, frankly, the idea that necessarily marketizing something will improve the ecosystem or the social life or our economy. 20% of the human genome, for example, is now patented, which is inhibiting all sorts of innovation and research into all sorts of diseases. And fresh water and groundwater is being turned into branded bottled water, which is having some serious ecological consequences, and so on. So there's a whole phenomena of enclosure associated with the commons. When it comes to city, a lot of enclosure is occurring through global speculation in urban real estate, where investors from China or sovereign nation funds are buying up building and land. The Chinese are major investors in New York and London, for example. And this is starting to force people to leave their neighborhoods. They can't afford to live there anymore. And modest properties are being redeveloped into gated corporate headquarters or luxury apartments, which is starting to drain the life out of the city and the kind of diversity that makes a city great and lively and fun. Enclosures happen in many ways in the city, however. There's a lot of ghost neighborhoods, you might say, where Airbnb has marketized, made it more economically valuable to rent out apartments for tourism rather than for a thriving neighborhood to exist. You have the over-commercialization of public spaces, naming of stadiums, for example. You have the development that is chiefly keyed to the affluent and not to ordinary people. You have austerity politics often draining the quality of city services, making them inferior. And you have bureaucratic command versus commoning, meaning centralized bureaucracies are dictating how things will occur rather than people getting together and deciding how they want to manage it themselves. And then increasingly, as data and networks become more ubiquitous, you're having private control of public data, which is increasingly a concern about how we can manage this infrastructure to benefit everyone, as opposed to just those companies that happen to control the data. So the question I think we need to confront is, how do we reclaim our commons, reclaim our cities as a commons? And I think the first step is we need to stop the enclosures. We need to start to treat our vital urban resources, whether they're infrastructure or social life or networks and data, spaces, we have to treat them as shareable commonwealth, because that's how more value is going to be created long term, as opposed to enclosing them. And we have to start to recognize that the commons generates value. It's not a tragedy. I think once we start to realize that when infrastructure is shared and people have the opportunity to be empowered and to create things themselves, that this creates more value ultimately, and it does so in a way more than if a private business might own it, perhaps capturing monopoly rents, perhaps keeping the city hostage to a narrow business model and having a dependency. So we need to, I think, have these discussions about how is more value created, and not just standard economic value, but the broader civic and cultural and social value. And one example of this happening is the Creative Commons licenses, which shows that instead of holding intellectual property as closely as possible, but instead letting it be shared and copied and exchanged, you create much more value in terms of creativity and information and knowledge. And that's what's happened as Creative Commons licenses have moved around the world, and there's more than 1 billion works of information and creativity that are licensed by it in more than 170 countries. And we also see this in the open source software revolution, where there's just dozens, hundreds of programs that rely upon communities volunteering to create new and interesting code, often in collaboration with proprietary software companies. So it's not necessarily an either-or proposition. It can be quite synergistic in creating value, one working in the market and one through a community. And now the open source revolution is going to yet another level, as we have lots of different global design communities with local production. So for example, we have FarmHack, which is about open source agricultural equipment. A global design world, lots of different communities in different places producing cheaper, modular, locally sourceable tractors and specialized equipment. We have the WikiSpeed car, again, totally open source, gets 100 miles per gallon. Arduino and a whole array of electronic circuit boards. And FabLabs as one area for this local production. Barcelona, of course, has quite a diverse array of specialized FabLabs in which this is occurring, which really constitutes the rudiments of a very different type of regional economy that I think cities need to tap into. As all of this suggests, the Commons is enacting a different universe of value, one that's more resilient and arguably more innovative. And it starts with the relationality of people as opposed to simply economic transactions that may be short-term and money-based. And it's about responsibility and entitlements being linked and having a focus on long-term stewardship and not just short-term gain. So, this is about meeting basic needs first. It's about honoring custom and tradition and local knowledge, which is often far more subtle than textbook kind of knowledge. And it's about inalienability. Some things should not be for sale on the market, and actually more value might be created that way when you think about it than if it's necessarily turned into a commodity. So it gets us to the question, how do we reinvent the city as a commons? Now, there's a lot of overlap between the city as a commons and the idea of smart cities or the sharing economy, but there are some differences. The smart city world tends to be more top-down and expert-driven as opposed to bottom-up driven. And the sharing economy is not really the sharing economy, it's more of the micro-rental economy, and therefore it has a different orientation than the commons. But I want to focus on the commons as a very distinct area. All three of them share a concern for using digital technologies and networks to improve human life, but the commons has an accent on bottom-up participation driving that. And it starts, I think, with thinking about the city as a living social system of interdependent creative agents. And instead of seeing people's capacity to act on their own behalf as an impediment that you have to bulldoze through politics or law or public relations campaigns, it sees individual agency as something to leverage. That's a real source of power. And if the city can tap into that, it can deal with real problems with a diverse array of talents and energies that it otherwise couldn't pay for, quite literally. But this implies some different ways of governing and managing. In a world of ubiquitous networks, it's increasingly difficult to push and control from the top down, which is why you have to use open source ideas and principles to poll and encourage people to participate and give them the frameworks for participating. And this will surface a lot of creativity that you had no idea existed in the first place, as some of the examples from open source software suggest. And this also means cultivating a culture of citizen-led innovation, which again helps get beyond some of the silo-driven mentality of bureaucrats and gets into a more open, collaborative field of social practice. All of this inframed, of course, by the necessity of protecting against enclosure, meaning think long and hard about how much you want to enclose certain resources and private property rights versus how much you want to have shareable because more value will be created. One of the leading pioneering examples in this is Bologna, Italy, where they created the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of urban commons. And essentially what it is a post-bureaucratic collaboration between the city government and self-organized citizen groups and neighborhoods to take care of parks and public spaces, to renovate abandoned buildings, to deal with elder care and kindergartens. And the citizen groups are given genuine authority and responsibility with fiscal and technical assistance, and they enter into what might be called a public commons partnership, as opposed to a public-private partnership, which too often is a synonym for draining the public purse for private benefit. The public commons relationship is an attempt to bring citizens into the governance of the city, as opposed to just simply delegating it to the experts. So it's a very interesting experiment going on, which has been replicated in a number of other Italian cities. And this and other examples show that we have to think about innovation not just as a technological thing, but as a social thing. You know, the wiki technology was invented in the late 90s. It took 5 years or more for Wikipedia to figure out the social innovations that made wikis more constructive and generative. But we're seeing, I think, a social shift right now with a lot of FabLabs and makerspaces as new social forms for creating valuable stuff through a commons-based collaboration that brings everybody from PhDs and professionals into collaboration with amateurs and teenagers and hobbyists. This spirit is exemplified, I think, in GuiFiNet, the telecommunications network for Wi-Fi here in Barcelona that has more than 30,000 active nodes. They are quite self-aware of how they run themselves as a commons, a free and neutral, non-discriminatory network for people to use more cheaply in a way that serves their needs and not necessarily or not just the business model of, say, a conventional provider. There's a whole maker city movement that's growing around the world, much of it led in San Francisco, where this ethic is finding new ways to reimagine the local economy that draws upon this rich reservoir of active voluntary participation. Part of the challenge here is making these things visible. And I'm pleased to say that the EU-sponsored report on peer-to-peer value has developed an extensive theoretical typology of studying different types of common-based peer production, all in an effort to give some conceptual clarity to this seemingly vague set of examples. But to give you an idea of how real it is, in Barcelona, the Barcelona Directory Initiative has itemized some 1,300 different examples of commons-based collaborative projects here in the city. In San Francisco, this makerspace project and the city government collaborated to do an urban prototyping festival where they took this long boulevard, Market Street, 2 miles long, which was a very busy commercial thoroughfare, and they wanted to reinvent it as a pedestrian-friendly area. And they invited artists and performers and others to propose their own alternatives, and then they prototyped them on the street for 2 weeks and looked at how people interacted with the various installations and displays, and used that data to redesign the street. It's sort of a fascinating example of this interactive conversation with people in an open model for urban planning and design. It's really a new frontier. There's also a movement called platform cooperativism. They had a major conference in New York City just this past weekend, which is trying to develop shared platforms in cities and trans-regionally for all sorts of things, but as an antidote to the so-called Death Star examples of Uber and Airbnb, where a single player can just utterly dominate a certain sector of activity. And they want to have platforms that will allow multiple players to have access to that activity. So it creates more competitive markets and arguably more innovative ones as well, but certainly also does it in a way that's compatible with the needs of the local community. And I might add, the data is more likely to be shared and used in an open source manner rather than controlled by a single player or two. They recently produced this book called Ours to Hack and Own, which describes the realm. And the Internet of Ownership is a website that has a listing of several dozen of these different platform cooperatives. Alternative currencies is another frontier that many regions are starting to explore as a way to retain some of the value that is created there, as opposed to it being siphoned away by outside investors. I've heard that Barcelona is in the early stages of exploring such a thing. I live in Western Massachusetts in the US, and we have the Berkshires nearby. There's the Berkshires Mountains, so it's a play on that term, but it's been a very successful regional currency in helping that region reinvest in itself through ordinary activity. But there's many others around the world. The Bangla Pesa has helped revive a poor neighborhood in Kenya by providing means of exchange when the official currencies are in short supply. But the point of all of this is we need to leverage open networks and shareable data to support commoning, as opposed to some of these really ubiquitous, ultra-aggressive, and sometimes, frankly, anti-democratic alternatives. And so the point is, these things are emerging. I don't want to neglect some of the non-digital, more traditional forms of commoning in cities. One is the Urban Land and Housing Trust, which is a way of decommodifying land so that the rents and purchases of condos can be cheaper in cities. So it's a way of sort of taking out of intense market or speculative competition certain socially important functions, such as affordable, diverse housing. Urban agriculture and community gardens is another area of immense importance, not only for growing the food we need, but doing it locally with higher quality food and reducing the carbon footprint that will be required to grow food, which is going to be increasingly important in the years ahead. The Participatory Budget Project has promoted and kept track of some 1,500 different examples of citizens participating with their city to set budget priorities for their neighborhoods in ways that the downtown bureaucrats may not understand, but the neighborhood says, we need that playground or we need that street sign fixed. Things like that. I think this is an example that can be built upon, especially as many deliberative decision-making platforms such as Lumio, where I understand that the Barcelona City Council has its own participatory platform. As these platforms grow and mature and get new functionalities, I think they'll be of immense value to cities in trying to serve people better. So to wrap up, why treat the city as a commons? It's important to unleash the creative social energies that this can do. And it helps reduce costs by spreading the cost among so many people, as opposed to investors often siphoning some of that value away, or too much of that value away. It enlivens social life beyond simply buying and selling, and that's important to a city. And it empowers people and gives them a sense of fairness, because they have a role in creating the rules by which these systems are governed. And it's a way in which I think cities can be incubators for developing new sorts of solutions to systemic problems. And I might add there will be lots of transnational partners in this because there are many cities from Amsterdam to Seoul, Korea, to Barcelona, to San Francisco, and many smaller and mid-sized cities that are actively involved in this quest, as well as many movements and projects. So I think that this is an important element of the discussion about how we are going to reinvent cities for grappling with some of the systemic ecological and social and economic problems of our time. So I wish to thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, David. If there is any question, you can approach one of the microphones we have downstairs. You also can use the communication tools that the organization provided. We have here one question that arrived already, which is not clear if it is a proposal or a preoccupation, which asks, do we abolish copyright?
I don't think we need to abolish copyright. People may not appreciate that the Creative Commons licenses depend upon copyright law. They depend upon the copyright owner saying, I'm making this work shareable in the future. So I think copyright has valuable purposes. The problem has been it's extended and pushed, I think, further than it should have been, and legislatures are not very receptive to the citizenry. They're more responsive to industry, copyright industries. And so we do have genuine problems there, but I don't think abolishing it is either feasible or necessarily advisable.
Another question is how, if I understand, because there are some problems types, how to make possible that certain cultures are more receptive toward the idea of the commons?
Well, I think as the commons becomes seen more or less as an abstract idea, but something that is active in people's lives, be it through community-supported agriculture or any of the examples I cited in my talk, that people start to say, this is an attractive alternative that can meet my needs in a more socially constructive way that I have some control over. And I think that that's really an attractive thing, especially in these politically polarized times, for getting people of diverse persuasions to come together for a concrete shared goal around a resource they love. And I think that's really what makes the commons attractive or not. I confess that the terminology of the commons and much of its history is not widely known. But I think as people get more examples in their daily lives, they'll appreciate it more fully. So,
if there aren't more questions from the floor, I would like to make it one, because I think it's interesting to reflect, all of us, especially in a space like this one, which is mainly a space which has been created around business and this kind of models of thinking the development of new technologies and of the transformation of the society and the cities in particular. I think it's interesting to reflect, and you presented in some way a trajectory of the commons which is mainly described along with the growth of communities that have been building their own institutions, forms of regulating and of producing goods and wealth. But we observe, and this is interesting to reflect about that, all of us, more and more hybrids, that are forms where, as you also were saying, where companies use this model of production. This especially has been true in the most advanced fields of innovation, like the software, beginning with the software, but going along with in a very broad spectrum of cases, where companies are endorsing and developing, contributing, or leading the developments which are based on this model of productions. And so what can we say about that?
I think that many companies have come to realize that in a network-based world, there's more creative value created on the network than they can ever possibly assemble within their own company. And so within the software, the proprietary software world, they have come to depend and welcome open source software communities as a way of doing a lot of work that they would otherwise have to pay for. And moreover, it's not necessarily a competitive threat, but more a prod for them to apply their business models to where they can create the most value instead of simply monopolizing a certain silo of types of software. When open source software, when Linux was first emerged, many companies said, oh, this is communism or some anti-market phenomena, but it's proved to be entirely synergistic and compatible with conventional business work. Business is able to do what it does well, and the commons of code development can work in the way it does. So I think there's a lot of areas where the commons and business activity are quite compatible. But the trick is structuring it in a way such that the commons can be protected from being marketized or taken over by market forces, which can often lead to its enclosure and destruction. So there's a balance that needs to be struck between these communities and market activity.
Just now arrived many more questions, but we have just the time for one that was repeated by two people. That is, isn't this model a sort of privilege that can be discussed and approached just from the point of view of the privileged first world? This is the question.
No, I mean, the point is throughout history, there's an estimated 2 billion people around the world whose everyday life depends upon their access and management of water, farmland, fisheries, forests, as commons. So this is, and these people are not often first world people, but I might add, there are plenty of still managed land commons in Europe itself. I think this is a timeless human form, and it's an accessible one because you don't have to have huge amounts of capital. You just need to have a group of people who agree we're going to share this resource in an equitable, fair way through rules that we make. And that's a very accessible way of managing something, and might even say a lightweight infrastructure for doing so.
So thank you very much, David. Thank you to you all for being here. And I hope you have had some inspiration now that you are going back home.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to David.